We're going to look at the all-time greatest case of mistaken identity. The all-time greatest case of mistaken identity. Now, there's a story about a regular golf foursome who were playing around and they had made it to the sixth hole. And the sixth hole was rather unique because there's a bridle path that was right alongside of it. And that's bridle in the sense of a horse's bridle, not bridle in the sense of those women in the fancy gowns that run around. It took me a while to make that connection myself. You probably got that right away. But one of the golfers, named Eddie, had just driven his ball beautifully right down the middle of the fairway. And as he walked toward the ball, there's this young woman who was on a horse, and she was having problems with the horse. The horse was not staying on the bridle path, it was out there in the fairway. So Eddie went over to her and started to offer some advice. But he was interrupted by the young woman. "Look, Shorty," she said curtly, "let's stick to what we know. I'll ride the horse, and you hit the little white ball." And with that, and with great difficulty, she resumed riding, leaving Eddie standing there speechless. She would never know that the man whose advice she declined was none other than Hall of Fame jockey Eddie Arcaro. Oops! Could have some free advice on how to handle the horses there, but she missed it. Perhaps you have a similar story, or an embarrassing moment when you or a friend did not recognize someone of importance, and then realized later on that you missed a golden opportunity. Well, our passage today contains the all-time greatest case of mistaken identity in the history of mankind. And we're going to draw 4 points from this passage this morning. First, we're going to see a private discussion going on. Secondly, a stranger enters the discussion. And then third, we will examine the contents of their discussion. And finally, we will listen to an enlightened discussion. So on to our first point, a private discussion. Let's look at verses 13 and 14 of Luke 24. Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. Well, we wonder, first of all, who are these 2 people? Who are they? Well, one is named Cleopas, as Luke later informs us, and the other person remains a mystery. Don't know who he is. What does Luke mean when he says that there were 2 of them? Well, the answer to this is found back in verse 9, where it says, "When they," that is the women who went to the tomb, "came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the disciples and to the others." And to the others. So Cleopas, we know, was not one of the apostles. And therefore, he and his companion here were part of these others, quote unquote, who were followers of Jesus. They were part of the wider circle of Jesus' disciples. I'm sure they had heard Jesus preach perhaps many times, but they were never in on those tight discussions that Jesus had with just the 12. They had probably witnessed some of his miracles, but since they were not with Jesus all the time, they did not get the entire picture of who Jesus was. However, Jesus is about to remedy that, since he desires that everyone, including you and me, know him well. We also see in these 2 verses that these 2 are on their way to Emmaus. This town is not particularly significant to the story. It just so happens that Emmaus is about 7 miles from Jerusalem, which makes for a pretty good aerobic workout. Not that we were concerned about aerobics back in that day. It's just their way of life. They had to walk everywhere they went. Today we drive 7 miles to a gym, plunk down some good money, and walk on a treadmill an hour before we drive back home again. But that's life in America today. And what a country. What a country. Now, we may wonder why they were going to Emmaus. We're not really sure. Perhaps that was where that they lived. Now, as you know, Jesus celebrated the Passover with his disciples just before he was crucified. And now that Passover holiday is over. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was this week-long celebration that occurred right after the Passover. So no doubt in their thinking, the holiday has just been ruined by Jesus' death. So there's really no reason to hang around in Jerusalem for that week, and so they walk home to Emmaus, filled with disappointment and sorrow. Another observation we need to make is the fact that there are 2 of them. There are 2 of them. Now, this is a highly significant fact, since the law of Moses states back that you need 2 or 3 witnesses for a testimony to be valid. And therefore, what we read here in Dr. Luke's account is indeed a true story about Jesus. There are 2 witnesses that confirm it. Not that the rest of Luke's book is not inspired or anything like that, but due to these highly unusual events that happen in this story, we are now assured of its accuracy because it was witnessed by 2 people. Finally, we see in verse 14 that they are engaged in quite a discussion. The passage could actually be translated as, they kept discussing all these things which had happened. They kept discussing all these things which would happen. So it would take a while to walk 7 miles. Now, if they did a mile every 15 minutes, it would take them an hour and 3/4 to get to their destination. A good deal of conversation in that amount of time. And a great deal has occurred in our eyes this past week, starting out with the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, and then the torture and execution of their beloved teacher, Jesus, and a most unusual report by some women who visited his tomb very early in the morning. And all this left them in a very sullen mood, very sullen mood. And we find them so engrossed in their conversation that they don't even notice this stranger who is walking alongside of them. And that brings us to our second point. A stranger enters the discussion. Let's look at verse 15. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. So Luke identifies the stranger for us immediately, while the 2 people in the story, they kind of remain clueless as to who he was. Luke emphatically states that it's Jesus himself. It's Jesus himself, nobody else. Now, Luke does not really tell us how long Jesus walked along with them before he joins in their conversation, but it's clear that Jesus did not just appear right in front of them and fire off this question. That makes us think, too, like today even. Jesus is around, unobserved, listening in to our conversations. Oh yes, he's very interested in all that we say and do. And that should kind of make us pause and consider what actually comes out of our mouths. Really need to think about that. Because Jesus warned that we're going to give an account before God before every careless word that we speak. He said, "But I tell you that everyone will have to give an account on the day of judgment for every empty word that they have spoken." So we do not perceive it, but the Lord is listening. He's listening. So it's really good to discuss wholesome things, and even better to converse about spiritual things when we get together with other people. Maybe there's a challenge for us all to be intentional to have at least one conversation like that every day. But back to our text. Now, these 2 words, verse 16 says, they were kept from recognizing him. They were kept from recognizing him. Well, how did that happen? What, was the sun in their eyes? Was Jesus... Did he put on his sunglasses and so they couldn't tell who he was? Neither one of those. Neither one of those. Keeping them from recognizing Jesus was a work of God. That was God at work. Well, why would God do such a thing as that? Well, the purpose of this whole episode was for the building up of their faith. God wants to build up their faith. And Jesus needed time with them to teach them without the distraction of them immediately recognizing him. If he walked up, "Oh, Jesus, oh, there's something." "Well, I'd like to talk to you about a few things." "No, it's you, you're alive." And so the whole time would have been lost. And so God has done this just to make sure that he has that time with them and can teach them. Well, does Jesus really do that kind of thing? Yes, oftentimes we may not think he is around, but rest assured he is there. He is there. So why don't we feel he's there when we're hit with a pandemic of coronavirus? Well, for pretty much the same reason they were kept from recognizing him. It's to build up our faith as well and gives the Lord a chance to teach us about some things. Now, for those of you that know Jesus very well, he wants to see if you're going to believe him and trust in him, and he's going to take that time to teach you. For those of you that don't know Jesus very well, he wants to see see if you will believe him. And he invites you to put the evidence for God to the test. Investigate the evidence about Jesus. If you don't believe he's risen from the dead or if he is the Son of God, investigate. He's telling you to do it. Let me tell you about two people that actually did so. Simon Greenleaf was one of the great minds of American legal history. He taught law at Harvard, and he wrote his 3-volume study for lawyers about the rules of legal evidence. And also in that he gave the means for which you can authenticate documents and that how witnesses can be tested. Well, after he wrote that, he put this all down, he then took his own rules and he applied them to the New Testament. And he concluded, this is an authentic document. So he's this great legal mind who looks at this and says, yes, this is an authentic document. We can trust it. There's another fellow by the name of James Smith. Maybe you never heard of him. But he did study on the voyage and shipwreck with St. Paul in Acts chapter 27. And he found that every detail that Luke gave was historically accurate. So when they pull into a harbor, oh, yeah, that's exactly what the book of Acts says there. It's not like Luke is making this up. Every time they would stop at a place and the particular ruler would have a particular title, Luke had it right. He had it exactly right. And so it's accurate. The Bible is always accurate. And so when the Bible is tested, it's always found out to be true. So it really comes down to you, whether or not you will accept Jesus as the Son of God and your Savior, and then continue to trust in him. Now Luke has more to tell us in this remarkable story. In verse 17, Jesus involves himself in their conversation by asking, what are you discussing? What are you discussing? Luke's narrative then becomes truly masterful in the next few lines. Here they are, the three of them. They're walking along. And the newest member of the group asks a question, and Luke writes literally, and the gloomy ones stopped. And the gloomy ones stopped. I take it from that phrase that Jesus probably kept walking a few more steps, but these gloomy ones, they stopped dead in their tracks. Isn't that just like gloomy people? They just let life come to a halt. They get that sullen look on their face, But there's no need to be gloomy. There's no need to be gloomy. There's no need to. They don't even consider the fact that Jesus is risen. He's risen. But listen to what Cleopas says to Jesus. Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and you do not know the things that have happened there in these days? He finds it incredible that someone could be so uninformed. So uninformed. We might put this question in today's vernaculars. Where have you been, buddy? Where have you been? How come you don't know what's going on? This is the big news of the day. Everybody knows about it. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody except the stranger. Everybody except him. Now, I love the next part. Here's this gloomy, down-in-the-mouth person, this gloomy Gus, we could call him, who I think we could say at this point is also sounding a little bit peevish. He sounds a little peevish, too. And when you think about it, he is really the one that's not up to snuff on current affairs, especially those which concern the Lord Jesus Christ. Because over here, a couple paces away, is the Lord Jesus who knows firsthand what has happened in Jerusalem and beyond that. And Cleopas asks this question, don't you know what has happened? And Jesus responds with that just one word in the Greek text. Poia means what? What? And what things have happened? Now, I hope you'll pause here and just appreciate the humor that's going on here, because this really is amusing. If you're standing there, and you know that the stranger is Jesus, and you're listening to these two other guys, you see this whole situation, you would have started to chuckle. God gave us a sense of humor, and he didn't insert it into our brains, not knowing himself what humor is. And even though the overall message of the Bible is quite serious, there are bits of humor sprinkled in there. Because think about it. This is the first Easter Sunday, the most joyous day in Jesus' life. He's risen from the dead. He's accomplished the eternal purpose of glorifying God through the redemption of mankind. He's conquered death. Why should his face be downcast? It shouldn't be. There's no reason for that. And so he asks tongue-in-cheek, what things have happened? What things have happened? Now, he didn't ask that question because he was suffering from amnesia, nor is he playing psychiatrist attempting to bring out Cleopas' suppressed feelings or something like that. Nothing against psychiatrists. My point here is that Jesus is overjoyed this day. And what has happened life. And so we can't pass up this opportunity to enjoy the moment and also to make a point to these two very depressed people. Now, many people walk around today depressed because they don't know the whole story about Jesus. Now, they know the Christmas story. Yeah, Jesus was born back then. But the Easter story is that Jesus is alive today. He's alive today. And because of that, he promised, remain in me, and I will remain in you. John 15:4. What is that talking about? It's talking about a daily relationship that we can have with Jesus. It means joy in knowing that all of our sins, past and present and future, are going to be forgiven. It means that he is always right there no matter what happens in life. We may get worried and upset, but he has everything well in hand. Now, these two men will eventually have a good laugh when they realize that they